Awesome. Do you
Oh,
have anything else or you want us to kick it off?
yeah, I'll just share a little bit about A Good Place Therapy. We are a bi-coastal practice, uh, and we have over 30 therapists on both coasts, and we specialize in anxiety, grief and loss, depression, trauma, body image, maternal mental health. It really runs the gamut on all the topics that we cover, and Nora and Sarita will speak more to that toward the end. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can direct message them to me if you would prefer. We will get to the questions at the end just so that we can kind of like go with the flow of the conversation. So I'll just kick it off to Nora and Sarita.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro, Daniela. As Daniela said, Nora and I are both therapists in training at a good place and currently graduate students at Columbia. We're so excited to have everyone here to discuss this topic of growing up between or navigating multiple cultures. But before we get started, we both just wanted to briefly touch on our personal connection to this topic and this experience. So for myself, I am a third culture kid. Both my parents immigrated to the US as adults. So I personally identify as a first generation American. I also identify as biracial, and I was raised in a multicultural household. And growing up, I didn't really understand why my experience felt so different from what I saw the people around me going through. So, just being able to discuss and name what this experience can often feel like or even look like is something that I personally wish I had access to while I was growing up. So, we're really excited to expand on this topic tonight and share it with all of you.
Thanks, Sarita. So I will also do the same. I am Nora. I identify as an international adoptee who was raised in a biracial household, primarily a white environment growing up. So this is something that led to a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration early on in my life. I had to figure out my own culture, and oftentimes I had to validate my identity to those who were around me, people I encountered who were confused about what my family was and what we looked like. And so it was definitely frustrating, but I've learned throughout my life and I'll continue to learn that I have control over how I want to show up. I don't need to conform to others' expectations around my identity, and I can choose the environments that I'm in. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just an overview of some of the topics that we'll be covering today, so you can get a little bit of a sneak peek before we dive in. And then before we begin, I do want to reiterate that today's webinar is really just going to scratch the surface on this topic. We want to recognize that people might have joined for various reasons. So whether one is directly impacted by this topic, whether someone has a loved one who is impacted by this, or maybe works in an environment where this may benefit them in their learnings. These are all really valid reasons. We're very grateful that you're spending this time with us here tonight. Additionally, we do have limited time, so we won't really be able to get to the depth that we would like to, but we do have some dedicated time, as Danielle mentioned, at the end for questions. So as you go through, if anything comes up, feel free to message those directly to Daniela so we can keep track of them. And then lastly, the experience of navigating multiple cultures can show up in a lot of different ways, which is evident in our introductions. Sarita and I both come from very different backgrounds, but we share a lot in experience. So take what resonates tonight, leave what doesn't, and be curious, be open. Something else is that, the concept of race and culture has a lot of larger societal implications. Tonight, we're really going to be focusing more on an individual level and about how to be your most authentic self within this experience. So I'll hand it over to Sarita.
Thank you, Nora. So we would love to kick off this discussion with really validating this experience of what it's like to grow up or experience life through a multicultural lens. As the nuances of this experience aren't often discussed in a lot of spaces. So like Nora mentioned, this can really look different for everyone. You might hold 2 or more racial or cultural backgrounds. You might have been raised in one culture and you're now located in another, so on and so forth. It can look a lot of different ways. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways that someone might be able to resonate with this topic, but we wanted to make space to call out some of the feelings that can arise as a result of this experience, and as a result of navigating life through multiple cultures. So one of those things is feeling like you don't belong to either side. So there can be a lot of confusion and frustration around feeling like you don't belong to one culture or the other. It's healthy and it's a part of our human nature to want to belong to a group and to feel connected to community. So when in our personal lives, we are faced with multiple options, we might feel internal or external pressure to fit one. And sometimes shame can come up around this idea that we don't fit into just one mold. There can also be this societal expectation to identify as part of one cultural community or another, depending on what your experience has been, particularly if this is something that you dealt with growing up. Our brains are constantly developing. And so in adolescence, we might not be aware of the nuances that each person's cultural identity can hold, or we might not have had that ever validated for us. So this is another really important part of the experience. And lastly, we might feel this pressure to assimilate to a given cultural group or even hide parts of ourselves in order to then attain that sense of belonging. And again, this is very normal. We seek to fit into the environment that we're engaging in at a given moment. So the goal for us today is really to increase our awareness of some of these feelings, acknowledge how they might be playing out in our current lives, and then begin to develop skills to navigate these experiences. So we spoke a little bit about the pressure that one might feel to belong. And one way that we might externalize this pressure to assimilate into one group or another is through a practice called code switching, which you may or may not have heard of. Code switching involves the switching of habits based on your environment or based on your social context. And in a cultural context, that might look like changing the language that you're using, changing your dialect or accent or the cadence in which you speak, switching up even physical mannerisms or adjusting your traditions based on the environment that you're in or who you might be with at a given time. So in a cultural context, we typically use code switching to establish a sense of safety in a given situation. And while that can potentially help us feel safer, either physically or emotionally, it can also unconsciously reinforce the belief or the idea that there might be something wrong with us, or that we can't fully show up as ourselves, or that we're not deserving of acceptance. So becoming familiar and starting to consider and become aware of how and when we might be code switching can help us identify areas where we might actually feel safe to show up as who we are. And then we can focus on building community in those environments. Next, we're going to briefly just touch on some of the effects that can come from either hiding or repressing certain parts of our identity. Essentially, why is this such difficult work? And you can tell through the slide, there are a couple of things here. It can look like being really exhausted, feeling detached, feeling irritable, or maybe dissatisfied with our day-to-day lives. Depending on what vocational context you find yourself in, you could struggle with performing in work or in school, or even feeling lower levels of personal accomplishment. And even if we belong to a historically marginalized group, we're still impacted by the oppressive framework around race and cultural identity in our society today. And so we can unintentionally internalize that as well, and effectively shame or even stereotype ourselves for being a certain way or for belonging to a certain group. And kind of in lieu of that, I want to address addressing why we might feel the pressure to code switch is also, as Nora spoke to, a much larger scale societal issue that continues to be worked towards. But for the purposes of this session, we are approaching it in the hope that just becoming aware of these things can help you make more informed decisions about how you want to show up in your life, who you want to build community with, and potentially increase your levels of self-acceptance and fulfillment. And I will pass it over to you, Nora.
Thank you. So let's explore a little bit more about these pressures that one might feel when talking about identity. Whether this be someone we know, might be a stranger, these are some things that can help provide some guidance or support. So to expand on something Sarita spoke about earlier on, we may feel pressure to pick a side of yourself to represent over the other. We also might feel pressure to disclose our identity before we're ready to do that. We might feel pressure to have all the answers, to educate others, and even potentially apologize for existing as you are or not engaging in the way that someone else may want you to. Speaking from personal experience, it can be really easy to become frustrated with oneself if any of these occur and one does give in to those external pressures. I often have to remind myself not to get upset if a conversation doesn't go exactly as I planned, or I end up giving over more than I wanted to originally. I've definitely felt some heightened fatigue at times in my life from educating other people and having to validate my experiences being adopted, being in a bicultural, multiracial family and environment. And that is something that you end up holding, and it's not something that you might realize you're holding. So just remember that it's okay to live in a gray area. There are times in our life where we might make decisions that align with one culture, and that might change. It's okay to continually assess how you feel. It's okay to make changes accordingly. How you want to show up in different environments can fluctuate based on even how you wake up that morning. Something that really helps is finding community and finding a strong support system. This can truly be life-changing. While it might be difficult to find these spaces, the ongoing benefit of being in them really does outweigh the initial challenge. So in talking about how do you find a lasting community, take your time, be patient, and ultimately prioritize your comfort. One of the ways that I always suggest or think about is reflect on the things that you like to do. So maybe you really enjoy art, maybe it's music or books, and try and find a place that facilitates that also happens to correlate with maybe your culture or part of your identity. This could be a fun pottery class geared towards adoptees or folks who are biracial. It could be a book club for women of color. These spaces do exist and they're growing. So be brave and immerse yourself in them, knowing that others are likely there for similar reasons. Finding peers and sharing experiences can provide real deep validation that someone might not know that they were seeking. I myself started to understand the importance of these spaces when I was in college. Being away from family and friends who I grew up with left me feeling really alone. But slowly and carefully, I found friends who ended up giving me something that I didn't know I was missing. I was able to find a space where I could discover myself, I could make mistakes, and I had the support throughout that. Learning how to be authentic and simultaneously imperfect is so paramount to this journey, and having a support system and having a community that I felt comfortable in really helped me do that.
So when we're discussing support spaces and a sense of community, which Nora so eloquently shared with us, family is something that comes up very naturally, and it can be tricky to navigate for those of us who have grown up or have lived experience across multiple cultures. So whether you're navigating, discussing your identity with your family, or you're sharing other parts of your life, there are a couple of things that can be helpful to keep in mind. First is identifying cultural values. So this is going to differ depending on how your cultural values might differ from that of your caregivers or family members. In individualistic cultures like the US, there can be a lot of emphasis on taking care of the self, a focus on work, and success, to name a couple of things. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, there is more of a focus on family, community, respecting and listening to your elders, and potentially even making sacrifices for the family as well. So this can mean that you might have contrasting perspective and values coming from different family members. So something to just consider and be aware of. Another is honoring boundaries. So that might look like recognizing when you might need to remove yourself from a situation or change the subject in order to best take care of yourself. It can be helpful to recognize that when we've reached capacity of what we can give in a certain situation or discussion, honoring the way that we feel can actually really help serve those relationships. And in contrast to that, it's also important to recognize and honor the limits that your parents or family members might have, and where they might not be able to meet your needs in the way that you would like. And that can come from a variety of things. It could come from their own upbringing, their values, what have you. And ultimately, just to return to Nora's point, seeking support and healthy forms of support are really, really important when we're navigating family dynamics, regardless of what your relationship looks like with family or with caregivers. So this can look like reaching out and connecting with friends, working with a therapist, anyone who you feel really has the capacity and ability to validate our experience. And if that's something that you don't feel like you have access to right now, some of those opportunities and spaces that Nora spoke to could be a really helpful starting place for that.
So as one might be embarking on this journey, maybe already on this journey, self-care and coping skills can really help provide some grounding. Oftentimes, moments of stress or anxiety can manifest in a physical way in the body. And so it's important to try and take notice of how the body is feeling, what's showing up in those moments. Maybe, hands are getting clammy, maybe your breath is shortening. It's just important to take stock of what's going on. One of the things that is a great introduction skill that might help is box breathing. And this is a really powerful and simple relaxation technique that essentially aims to return your breathing to its normal rhythm after a stressful experience. So this involves breathing in and out and holding the breath based on a specific count. And you end up essentially drawing a box as you do it. This can help clear the mind, it can relax your body, and it can improve focus. Additionally, engaging in activities that bring you joy and help you feel most like yourself is really important. And this does go back to the support system and building community that we talked about earlier. But this can show up in a lot of different ways. So it can be something like reading a book, crocheting or knitting. Maybe it's drawing, listening to music, cooking. It's all beneficial. And oftentimes what folks find is that doing things with your hands actually helps the brain slow down and focus. Having a tangible action can really ground you. Lastly, but certainly not least, is seeking support from the community that we have spent so much time and effort finding and building. It can feel easy. It can be easy to feel guilty when we find we need to lean on others, but remember that people show up because they want to. They've chosen to be part of your support system, and being seen and heard is integral to your healing and to this journey. So how can therapy help with this? Therapy is a dedicated time for us to prioritize ourselves. Life is busy, it is overwhelming, and knowing that there is a consistent, safe space to explore your identity, your culture, your background, and make mistakes is extremely healing. A therapist can help provide support. They can also potentially provide resources, learning tools. There's a myriad of things that you can gain from that relationship. And ultimately, prioritizing oneself and one's needs is the least selfish thing that you can do. We have to be able to heal ourselves before we can heal others. And it's okay if it feels a little weird at times, because it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but that's part of the journey. And I think in time, one might find that, it really does solidify who you are, and you're able to explore that comfortably.
And these are some resources that we've put together, just a collection of things that have really helped us and that we have found to be valuable resources, depending on how you receive information in the best way. Couple of different mediums here, social media, also some book recommendations and podcasts as well. But that sort of wraps up the presentation part of the evening. And I think we'd love to open it up to questions if anyone has any to share in the chat, or Daniela, if you received any prior to the presentation, we'd love to hear what questions might have come through.
Yes, thank you, Sarita and Nora, for a great presentation. I do have a few questions here. I'll start with one. How do I navigate making a decision that my family does not agree with?
Yeah, I can jump in on this one. I think quite a bit of it goes back to some of what we discussed on the family dynamic slide, but really one thing that can really help situations like that, they're going to be pretty nuanced, based on the decision or choice that you're making or conversation that you're having with family members. But just learning to identify those values, or cultural values that are coming into play can be really helpful. I think it can provide some separation between this is what my family thinks about this choice that I'm making versus this is what my family thinks about me. And it can just give us a little bit more breathing room to know some of the contrast or conflict that might be occurring isn't necessarily about us as an individual, but might just be a values conflict. Also, going back to honoring those boundaries and limits once again. And this is when working with a therapist could be really, really helpful, just to help you assess, what are my values in this situation? Like I said, it'll be nuanced based on, yeah, what decision it is that you're grappling with. But yeah, assessing what are my own values. And a therapist can really assist with navigating how might this decision help me live in alignment with those values, and consider, what elements of the decision might impact your well-being, might impact your relationships, and move forward with a decision in a way that feels like it's able to honor what you are wanting to honor in your life at that time. But yeah, knowing that it can go a lot of different ways based on what you're navigating would definitely encourage working through that with any kind of support that you may be able to get.
Thank you, Sarita. We have another question here. Someone is looking for advice on how to navigate overcoming internalized racism and internalized negative view of self.
I can start. I will acknowledge this is a complex question, and I appreciate the question. It does take time. I think that it's really important to give yourself grace and be kind to yourself. We are often impacted by the systems that we are in without really understanding that. And as we've talked about, this is a lifelong journey. And so as, curiosity comes up and as these moments of maybe clarity or understanding of, oh, I have something that I didn't understand, or I have internalized stereotypes or racism. Again, there can be a lot of guilt, there can be a lot of shame that comes up, but give yourself grace, take the time to understand that there's a lot of external influence on who we are as people, and finding strength and finding confidence in your identity and your background and how you want to present yourself takes trial and error. They're definitely happy to get into more specifics at potentially offline, but I think that really just understanding also where they come from, right? The sources of these feelings are important to understand and consider. Is it something that, is this somebody who you agree with? Is this an idea that you value? And that can help also reframe the thoughts that could be being internalized. Sarita, did you have other thoughts to add on there?
Yeah, I definitely can add. What you said was great. I have a couple thoughts to add. And I also just want to call out that that's a really important question. So I'm really glad that whoever asked that. Um, like Nora said, it's really hard and it is a lifelong journey. And I think acknowledging the shame and recognizing why it's there, as Nora kind of spoke to, is really important. And community is really important. So to provide, I guess, maybe an example, I grew up in a lot of predominantly white spaces, and I felt very different from a lot of people in the spaces that I was in. And that brought up a lot of shame for me because I felt like there weren't a lot of people around me who could connect to my experience. And as I sort of grew up, and expanded my communities and things like that, I actually realized that, there are people who have a lot of really similar experiences. And I think just talking about it with people can help normalize those feelings and help feel a little bit less alone and like you need to turn against yourself. I mean, even just working through this presentation with Nora, I feel like has been an aspect of healing that for me, because it's so normalizing of this experience and very validating of what it can look like. So yeah, just to sort of reiterate Nora's as well, Nora's points, having compassion is really the most important thing. And just working on cultivating that compassion, because it can be really hard. and community, and trying to find those safe spaces where you feel like there are people around you who really get what you're talking about, can be really, really helpful. And thank you so much for asking that.
That kind of meshes well into another question that we got. Someone asked, how can I support people in my life who are struggling with their own cultural identity?
I can kick us off, and Nora, feel free to chime in. Also a really important question. I think, so if you are coming from a place where a loved one or someone you know is struggling with this topic or in relation to this topic, I think becoming curious is the most important, or one of the most important things. It might, inquiring about someone's internal experience in such a way might mean that you get a little uncomfortable, or that your relationship enters new territory than what it's looked like in the past. And that's okay. And we just want to make sure when we are, navigating conversations like that, we are really placing the person struggling or dealing with this in the safest possible place and environment, physically or emotionally. So, also, an important aspect of that is allowing loved ones or whoever it is that you are discussing this with to share at their own pace. So, not, pushing to get someone to open up about this experience, and making sure that it's um, coming out in a way that honors your relationship and really helps them and allows them to feel safe. And then I think validation and just listening and knowing, like, we don't need to solve. We can just be there and allow someone to sit in their struggle, and that's okay. And listening can be one of the best things that you can do for someone who is, grappling with this, or, even if they're not struggling with it, but they just want to be able to talk about it with you. I think that's really important. Nora, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I think to expand on that, opening what you said about like having the space to be curious, I would also say helping this person lead with curiosity for themselves is really important as well. And sharing personal experience can honestly be your best friend. It's something that both Sarita and I did tonight, and in kind of grounding these topics that we've talked about, and doing that with a peer, with a friend, can really help them not feel alone, and is another way to validate what they've been going through. It's not necessarily about inserting your own experience into the discussion, but more just another way to show empathy, another way to show that they are not alone through this, and that other people understand what they're going through.
Thank you both. I think that's it for our questions. If anyone else has any questions, you can feel free to reach out to Sarita or Nora directly. You can also respond to my email that I sent earlier, and I can put you in touch with them. But thank you everyone for joining. Sarita and Nora, do you guys have any final words or something that you want to part with?
Sure. I'll just say, again, echoing elements of the presentation, this is a lifelong journey. And, give yourself grace, and it's okay to be where you are. And we hope that some of what we've shared today can just help validate some of the experiences that you might have gone through, or are currently going through, or will go through. And yeah, we are open. If you have any further questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to either of us. Nora, if you have anything to add.
I think you summed it up exactly. You kind of stole the words out of my mouth. But yeah, I just thank you so much for